On August 22, 1831, the fields of Southampton County, Virginia, were soaked with the blood of 60 enslaved souls who died in the brutal retaliation that followed Nat Turner's rebellion. But death, as the locals would soon discover, was not the end of their story. For nearly 2 centuries, witnesses have reported seeing ghostly figures walking the tobacco rows at dawn, their chains still rattling in the morning mist, their voices still crying out for the justice that was denied them in life. This is the true story of Southampton Plantation, where history's victims refuse to rest. Before we explore this chilling tale where history and the supernatural collide, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the spirits of the past have stories that demand to be heard. August 1831. Southampton County, Virginia was a powder keg of racial tension in the heart of the antebellum South. The county's population included over 16,000 enslaved people, outnumbering the white population, creating constant fear among plantation owners about potential uprisings. This fear would prove justified when Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher, launched the deadliest slave rebellion in American history. Southampton Plantation, owned by the Whitmore family, sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime tobacco land along the Nottoway River. Like other plantations in the region, it operated through the brutal exploitation of enslaved labor, with over 200 souls working the fields under conditions of systematic oppression and violence. The plantation's enslaved community was led by a man named Isaiah, a 45-year-old field hand who had been born on the property and had watched generations of his family live and die in bondage. Isaiah possessed the dangerous combination of intelligence and moral clarity that plantation owners feared most. He could read, he understood the injustice of his situation, and he had the respect of his fellow enslaved people. When news of Nat Turner's uprising reached Southampton Plantation on August 22, the enslaved community faced an impossible choice. They could join the rebellion and risk death, or remain passive and accept continued bondage. The historical records show that Turner's rebellion ultimately involved between 60 to 75 enslaved people who fought for their freedom. Isaiah gathered the enslaved people of Southampton Plantation in the pre-dawn darkness, knowing that every moment of delay increased the danger they faced. The rebellion was already underway 15 miles to the north, where Turner and his followers had killed entire white families in their quest for freedom. "Brothers and sisters," Isaiah reportedly said to the gathered crowd, "the day we've prayed for has come. The prophet Nat Turner has struck the first blow against our oppressors. We can join him and die as free people, or we can remain here and die as slaves." The decision was not unanimous. Some of the enslaved people, particularly the elderly and those with young children, feared the brutal retaliation that would surely follow any rebellion. Others, burned by years of abuse and degradation, were eager to fight for their freedom regardless of the consequences. James Whitmore, the plantation owner, had received word of the Turner Rebellion through the network of horsemen who were spreading warnings throughout the county. His response was swift and merciless. He would not wait to see if his enslaved people would join the rebellion. He would eliminate the threat preemptively. Whitmore gathered his 3 adult sons, his overseer William Crenshaw, and a dozen armed neighbors who had come to help suppress any local uprising. They were equipped with rifles, pistols, and the kind of systematic brutality that had maintained the slave system for generations. The plantation's enslaved people had gathered in the slave quarters, debating whether to join Turner's rebellion or flee to the north. Their meeting was discovered by young Tom Whitmore, who had been sent to check on the quarters and reported back to his father about the suspicious gathering. As dawn broke on August 23, Isaiah and 49 other enslaved people from Southampton Plantation made their decision. They would not join Turner's rebellion directly, but they would strike their own blow for freedom by eliminating the Whitmore family and taking control of their plantation. The plan was desperate, but carefully considered. They would strike during the morning meal when the family was gathered in the main house. They would seize the plantation's weapons and horses, then either join Turner's forces or attempt to reach Union territory in the north. But the Whitmores had anticipated this possibility. James Whitmore had positioned armed men around the slave quarters and was prepared to kill any enslaved person who showed signs of rebellion. The trap was set, and 60 enslaved souls were about to walk into a massacre that would stain the plantation soil with blood for generations to come. As the sun rose over Southampton Plantation on August 23, 1831, 2 groups prepared for a confrontation that would end in tragedy. The enslaved people gathered their courage for what they hoped would be their march to freedom, while the Whitmore family and their allies prepared for what they saw as necessary violence to preserve their way of life. Neither side could have anticipated that the events about to unfold would create something that transcended both historical record and natural law, a supernatural legacy that would haunt the plantation grounds for nearly 2 centuries, ensuring that the victims of that terrible day would never truly rest in peace. August 23, 1831, 6:30 a.m. Isaiah led 49 enslaved people toward the main house of Southampton Plantation, moving through the morning mist that rose from the tobacco fields. They carried whatever weapons they could find: farming tools, kitchen knives, and clubs fashioned from fence posts. They were not soldiers, but they were fighting for the most precious thing imaginable: their freedom. James Whitmore watched their approach from the upper windows of his plantation house, flanked by his armed sons and neighbors. He had positioned shooters in the tobacco curing barns, behind trees, and along the fences that bordered the slave quarters. The enslaved people walking toward what they hoped would be liberation were actually walking into a carefully planned killing field. The first shots rang out at 6:45 a.m., just as Isaiah and his followers reached the main yard of the plantation house. The initial volley killed 12 people instantly, their bodies falling onto the manicured grounds that had been maintained by their own labor for generations. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic massacre. The enslaved people, caught in the open with inadequate weapons, were cut down by rifle fire from multiple directions. Those who tried to flee found their escape routes blocked by armed men who had been positioned specifically to prevent any survivors. Sarah, a young woman who worked in the plantation house kitchen, was shot down as she tried to reach her 3-year-old son, who had been playing near the slave quarters. The child was killed moments later by Tom Whitmore, who later claimed he was preventing the boy from growing up to become a rebel. Old Moses, who was nearly 70 years old and had served the Whitmore family for 5 decades, was beaten to death with rifle butts despite his pleas that he had never intended to rebel and had only followed the group out of fear. His age and loyalty meant nothing to men who had decided that mass killing was the solution to their racial anxieties. The massacre at Southampton Plantation was part of a larger wave of retaliatory violence that swept through Southampton County in the wake of Turner's Rebellion. Historical records document that between 100 to 200 enslaved and free black people were killed in retaliation for Turner's uprising, many of them having no connection to the actual rebellion. The retaliatory killings were so extensive that they threatened to destroy valuable property. Enslaved people represented significant financial investments for plantation owners. General Richard Epps eventually issued orders to halt the indiscriminate killing, noting that the uncontrolled violence was destroying valuable assets. But at Southampton Plantation, the killing continued for nearly 2 hours. James Whitmore was determined to eliminate every person who had dared to consider rebellion, and his definition of rebellion was broad enough to include anyone who had been present in the slave quarters that morning. As the massacre continued, some enslaved people managed to hide in the tobacco barns, root cellars, and other structures around the plantation. But Whitmore's men systematically searched every hiding place, dragging out terrified families and executing them in front of their children. Among the final victims was a woman named Ruth, who had hidden her infant daughter in a tobacco barrel and tried to lead the searchers away from the child. Ruth was shot and killed, but her sacrifice saved her daughter's life. The infant would survive to tell the story of that terrible morning, though she would carry the trauma for the rest of her life. The killing finally stopped at 8:30 a.m., when 60 enslaved people lay dead across the plantation grounds. Their bodies were scattered from the main house to the slave quarters, their blood soaking into soil that had been worked by their hands and the hands of their ancestors. James Whitmore immediately began efforts to conceal the scale of the massacre. He reported to county authorities that his enslaved people had attempted to join Turner's rebellion and that he had been forced to defend his family and property. The official record would list only 12 deaths, claiming that the others had fled the plantation and disappeared. The bodies of the 60 victims were buried in unmarked graves in a corner of the plantation furthest from the main house. No marker was erected, no ceremony performed, no record kept of their names or their lives. They were erased from official history as completely as if they had never existed. But the enslaved people who survived would remember their names: Isaiah the leader, Sarah who died trying to save her son, Old Moses who had served faithfully for 50 years, Ruth who sacrificed herself for her child, and 55 others whose dreams of freedom had ended in blood and unmarked graves. The massacre at Southampton Plantation represents one of the most brutal examples of retaliatory violence in American history. If this account of forgotten tragedy is impacting you, please give this video a thumbs up to help preserve the memory of these victims who have been erased from official records. By the time the sun reached its zenith on August 23, 1831, 60 enslaved people lay dead on Southampton Plantation, their blood-watering tobacco plants that would grow with unusual vigor in the seasons to come. James Whitmore surveyed the carnage with satisfaction. believing he had eliminated a threat to his way of life and sent a message to any other enslaved people who might consider rebellion. But death, as the Whitmore family would soon discover, was not the end of the story for the 60 souls who had died that morning. Their bodies might lie in unmarked graves, their names might be erased from official records, but their spirits would prove far more difficult to silence. The massacre at Southampton Plantation had created something that transcended both life and death, a supernatural presence that would haunt the grounds for generations, ensuring that the injustice of that terrible morning would never be forgotten, even if it had been officially denied. September 1831. In the weeks following the massacre, life at Southampton Plantation attempted to return to normal. James Whitmore purchased replacement enslaved people from other counties, desperately trying to maintain his tobacco production despite the loss of 60 experienced workers. But normalcy proved impossible when the dead refused to stay buried. The first supernatural incident occurred just 10 days after the massacre. Mary Whitmore, James's wife, reported seeing figures moving through the tobacco fields at dawn, shadowy forms that appeared to be working the rows as they had in life. When she sent overseers to investigate, they found no one there, but the tobacco plants in those rows showed signs of recent cultivation. The new enslaved people brought to the plantation began reporting strange encounters almost immediately. They spoke of hearing voices calling their names from empty fields, of seeing faces in the windows of abandoned slave quarters, and of feeling invisible hands touching them as they worked. The overseer William Crenshaw dismissed these reports as superstition, but privately he had begun experiencing his own disturbing encounters with the supernatural. By October 1831, the supernatural activity at Southampton Plantation had intensified dramatically. The most frequently reported phenomenon was the sound of chains rattling through the tobacco fields, accompanied by voices singing the work songs that had once accompanied the daily labor of the plantation. Tom Whitmore, who had personally killed several of the massacre victims, began suffering from severe nightmares and claimed that he could see bloody handprints appearing on his bedroom walls. His sleep became so disturbed that he started sleeping with loaded pistols, though he could never explain exactly what he feared the weapons might accomplish against spiritual enemies. The plantation's horses became increasingly agitated, refusing to enter certain fields and becoming violent when forced to approach the area where the massacre had occurred. Several expensive animals had to be destroyed after they injured themselves trying to escape from apparently empty areas of the plantation. Local historical records from this period, preserved in county archives, document numerous witness accounts of supernatural activity at Southampton Plantation. A traveling Methodist minister named Reverend Samuel Hayes recorded detailed observations in his journal after visiting the plantation in November 1831. "The very air of this place seems heavy with unseen presence," Hayes wrote. "During my brief stay, I observed phenomena that challenge both reason and faith. Doors opening and closing without human agency, the sound of many voices singing hymns in fields where no living person could be seen, and most disturbing of all, the clear impression of invisible congregations gathering for worship in the ruins of the old slave chapel." Dr. William Morrison, the county physician, was called to treat several plantation workers who claimed to have been touched by invisible hands while working in the fields. Morrison initially dismissed these reports as hysteria, but his medical journal records his growing belief that something genuinely supernatural was occurring at the plantation. As autumn turned to winter, the supernatural manifestations at Southampton Plantation developed a systematic quality that suggested intelligence and purpose. The 60 spirits seemed to be recreating their daily routines, maintaining a ghostly version of the plantation life that had been violently terminated. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., the time when enslaved people had traditionally been awakened for work, the sound of a plantation bell could be heard ringing across the grounds, though the actual bell had been removed after the massacre. This spectral alarm was followed by the sounds of many people moving through the slave quarters, preparing for another day of labor that would never end. The tobacco fields themselves became the center of the most intense supernatural activity. Workers reported seeing entire crews of ghostly figures working the rows, their movements perfectly coordinated as if following the rhythm of work songs that could be faintly heard on the wind. The tobacco plants in these areas grew with unusual vigor, as if tended by invisible hands that understood their cultivation better than any living worker. The constant supernatural activity began taking a severe psychological toll on everyone associated with Southampton Plantation. The newly purchased enslaved people begged to be sold elsewhere, claiming that the plantation was cursed and that the spirits of the massacred victims would not allow the living to work in peace. James Whitmore himself began experiencing phenomena that challenged his materialist worldview. He reported seeing Isaiah, the leader of the failed rebellion, standing at the foot of his bed during the early morning hours, always at exactly 6:45 a.m., the time when the massacre had begun. He speaks no words, Whitmore confided to his diary, but his eyes hold an accusation that burns hotter than any fire. He shows me his wounds, the places where my bullets found their mark, and I understand that he is showing me the price of my actions. But I feel no remorse. I did what was necessary to preserve order. Word of the hauntings at Southampton Plantation spread throughout the county, creating fear and fascination in equal measure. Some residents interpreted the supernatural activity as divine judgment against the brutal retaliatory killings that had followed Turner's rebellion. Others saw it as evidence that the enslaved people had been dabbling in African mysticism and had somehow cursed the plantation before their deaths. Local ministers were divided in their interpretation of the phenomena. Some preached that the spirits were demonic influences that needed to be exorcised through prayer and fasting. Others argued that the hauntings represented the voices of the wrongfully killed, crying out for justice from beyond the grave. The supernatural reputation of Southampton Plantation began affecting its economic viability. Neighboring plantations refused to send workers to help with seasonal labor, fearing that their people would be contaminated by the ghostly influences. Merchants became reluctant to conduct business on the property, and the plantation's isolation increased with each passing month. By the end of 1831, Southampton Plantation had been transformed from a profitable agricultural operation into a supernatural battleground where the living and the dead existed in constant tension. The 60 spirits of the massacred enslaved people had established their presence so firmly that life on the plantation revolved around accommodating their ghostly routines. James Whitmore's attempt to erase the victims of his massacre from history had failed completely. Instead of silence and forgetfulness, he had created a supernatural legacy that ensured the story of August 23, 1831 would be told and retold for generations, even if only in whispers and ghost stories. The dead had found a way to demand the justice and recognition that had been denied them in life, turning Southampton Plantation into a place where history's victims could not be ignored, forgotten, or silenced. 1845, 14 years after the massacre, the Whitmore family remained trapped on Southampton Plantation by economic necessity and what increasingly appeared to be supernatural forces. Every attempt to sell the property had failed, as potential buyers fled after experiencing the plantation's ghostly phenomena during their visits. Tom Whitmore, now in his 30s, had never married despite his family's wealth. Local women claimed that he was followed by invisible presences that made their skin crawl, and several broken engagements had left him isolated and increasingly unstable. He had taken to drinking heavily and talking to empty rooms, as if carrying on conversations with unseen companions. The most disturbing development was the behavior of the Whitmore children born after 1831. These youngsters, who had no conscious memory of the massacre, demonstrated an uncanny ability to interact with the plantation spirits. They played games with invisible friends in the tobacco fields, sang work songs they had never been taught, and drew pictures of people who matched descriptions of the massacre victims. As decades passed, the supernatural activity at Southampton Plantation evolved and intensified rather than diminishing. The 60 spirits seemed to have established permanent residence on the property, creating a parallel community that existed alongside but separate from the living inhabitants. By the 1850s, visitors reported seeing an entire ghost town overlaying the physical plantation, spectral slave quarters that appeared more substantial than the actual buildings, phantom tobacco barns where invisible workers processed crops that only they could see, and a ghostly chapel where services were conducted in languages that combined English, African dialects, and something else entirely. The most frequent manifestation involved the reenactment of daily plantation routines. Every morning at dawn, witnesses could observe the ghostly enslaved community beginning their workday, moving through the fields in patterns that perfectly matched the agricultural cycles of tobacco cultivation. They worked, they sang, they gathered for meals, and they conducted their lives with the same rhythms that had been brutally interrupted on August 23, 1831. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought new dimensions to the supernatural activity at Southampton Plantation. As Union armies approached Virginia and the institution of slavery crumbled throughout the South, the plantation's ghosts seemed to sense that their long-awaited justice was finally approaching. Federal troops occasionally passed through Southampton County, and their officers' reports include remarkable descriptions of supernatural encounters at the plantation. Colonel Robert Hayes of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment recorded in his official dispatch, "During our reconnaissance of rebel agricultural resources, my men observed phenomena at the Whitmore plantation that defy rational explanation. We witnessed what appeared to be entire companies of Negro spirits conducting military drills in the tobacco fields, led by a tall figure who wore the bearing of a natural commander. My men, many of whom are former slaves themselves, claimed these spirits spoke to them of a great reckoning that was finally at hand. With the end of slavery in 1865, the supernatural activity at Southampton Plantation underwent a dramatic transformation. The 60 spirits seemed to have achieved a measure of the justice they had sought. Their status as property had been officially abolished, even though they had died 24 years earlier. The ghostly community began displaying new behaviors that suggested a sense of liberation. Instead of the repetitive work routines that had characterized their hauntings for decades, the spirits began engaging in activities that had been forbidden to them in life, gathering for education, conducting wedding ceremonies, and holding elaborate funeral rites for community members who had died without proper burial. James Whitmore, now an old man broken by decades of supernatural torment, made his final diary entry on January 1, 1866. They have won. The dead have proven stronger than the living, their justice more enduring than my violence. I see now that I did not kill 60 rebels on that morning in 1831. I created 60 eternal witnesses to my crimes. They have testified against me every day for 35 years, and they will continue their testimony long after my bones have turned to dust. As Southampton Plantation passed through various owners during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the supernatural phenomena continued with remarkable consistency. Each new generation of residents, workers, and visitors encountered the same fundamental manifestations: ghostly figures working the fields, the sounds of chains and work songs, and the overwhelming sense of invisible presences going about their daily routines. Local historian Margaret Thompson conducted extensive interviews with Southampton County residents in the 1940s, documenting more than 200 separate supernatural encounters at the plantation spanning over a century. Her research, preserved in the County Historical Society's archives, provides compelling evidence for the persistence and consistency of the hauntings. What strikes me most forcefully, Thompson wrote in her conclusions, is the consistent nature of these accounts across multiple generations of witnesses. People who have never met and have no knowledge of previous reports describe identical phenomena: the same ghostly figures, the same sounds, the same sense of a parallel community existing alongside our own. Throughout the 20th century, Southampton Plantation continued to demonstrate agricultural anomalies that defied scientific explanation. The tobacco plants in the areas where the massacre had occurred grew with exceptional vigor, producing crops that were consistently superior to those grown in other parts of the plantation or on neighboring properties. Agricultural extension agents from Virginia Tech conducted studies of the plantation soil in the 1960s, searching for chemical or geological explanations for the enhanced crop yields. Their reports noted unusual mineral compositions in the soil, but acknowledged that the patterns of agricultural success precisely matched the areas of supernatural activity rather than following any natural geological formations. The supernatural legacy of Southampton Plantation spans nearly 2 centuries of documented paranormal activity. If this exploration of history's intersection with the supernatural is captivating you, please share this video and subscribe for more stories where the past refuses to stay buried. By the end of the 20th century, Southampton Plantation had become legendary throughout Virginia and the broader South as one of America's most persistently haunted locations. The 60 spirits of the 1831 massacre had established themselves as permanent residents, creating a supernatural community that paralleled the living world while remaining forever separate from it. Their presence served as a constant reminder that historical injustices cannot simply be buried and forgotten. The victims of the massacre had achieved in death what had been denied them in life: recognition, remembrance, and a voice that could not be silenced by violence or official denial. The plantation had become a place where the past remained perpetually present, where the dead commanded the attention of the living, and where the price of historical violence was paid not once but continuously, generation after generation, ensuring that the memory of August 23, 1831 would never fade from human consciousness. Present day, 2024. Southampton Plantation, now a historical site managed by the Virginia Historical Society, continues to be one of the most actively haunted locations in the United States. Modern paranormal investigators, equipped with sophisticated recording equipment and scientific instruments, have documented phenomena that validates nearly 2 centuries of eyewitness accounts. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a paranormal researcher from Duke University, conducted a comprehensive study of the plantation in 2019. Her team recorded over 400 separate incidents during a 6-month investigation period, including electronic voice phenomena that captured voices speaking in historical dialects, temperature anomalies that corresponded to witness sightings, and electromagnetic field disturbances that followed patterns consistent with large groups of people moving through the property. What makes Southampton Plantation unique among allegedly haunted locations, Dr. Mitchell explains in her published research, is the consistency and historical specificity of the phenomena. The supernatural activity directly correlates with documented historical events, and the manifestations have remained remarkably stable across multiple generations of witnesses. The most compelling evidence for the plantation's supernatural activity comes from electronic voice phenomena recorded throughout the property. Modern digital recording equipment has captured hundreds of distinct voices speaking in historical dialects and languages that would have been used by enslaved people in 1831 Virginia. Among the most frequently recorded voices is one identified by historical linguists as matching the speech patterns of the Gullah Geechee culture that influenced enslaved communities throughout the Virginia coastal regions. This voice, speaking in a mixture of English and West African linguistic structures, consistently identifies itself as Isaiah and provides historically accurate details about life on the plantation before the massacre. Other recorded voices include women's voices singing work songs documented by folklorists studying 19th-century enslaved culture, children's voices speaking in dialects that disappeared from the region over a century ago, and elderly voices reciting prayers in languages that linguistic experts have identified as derived from various West African religious traditions. In recent years, Southampton Plantation has embraced its supernatural reputation as part of a broader educational mission to preserve the memory of slavery's victims and to confront the historical realities that many Americans prefer to forget. The Virginia Historical Society has developed programs that use the plantation's paranormal activity as a starting point for discussions about historical injustice, the treatment of enslaved people, and the ways that traumatic events can leave lasting imprints on both the physical and spiritual landscape. School groups visiting the plantation report educational experiences unlike any traditional history lesson. Students describe feeling the presence of historical figures, hearing voices that help them understand the human cost of slavery, and experiencing emotional connections to the past that transform their understanding of American history. The spirits at Southampton Plantation are teachers, explains Dr. James Washington, the plantation's current director. They provide a direct connection to historical experiences that no textbook can convey. They refuse to let us forget that slavery was not just an economic system but a human tragedy that affected real people with real lives, dreams, and dignity. The supernatural activity at Southampton Plantation shows no signs of diminishing as the property enters its third century of documented hauntings. If anything, the phenomena have intensified in recent years, as if the spirits are responding to increased public interest in their story and the growing recognition of their historical significance. Visitors from around the world come to Southampton Plantation seeking encounters with the 60 spirits, and few leave disappointed. The ghostly community that was created by the violence of August 23, 1831 continues to go about their eternal routines, working in visible crops, singing their work songs, and maintaining their parallel existence alongside the world of the living. Their presence serves multiple purposes. They preserve the memory of historical victims who were erased from official records, they provide direct testimony about the realities of slavery and racial violence, and they demonstrate that some injustices are so profound that they transcend the boundaries between life and death. The story of Southampton Plantation forces modern Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about their nation's history. The 60 spirits who walk the tobacco field serve as eternal witnesses to the systematic violence that maintained the slave system, and their refusal to rest in peace reflects the ongoing nature of historical injustice. Their supernatural presence challenges us to acknowledge that the past is not safely buried in history books but continues to influence the present in ways both visible and invisible. The victims of historical violence demand recognition, remembrance, and justice, and when these demands are ignored by the living, the dead find ways to ensure their voices are heard. Southampton Plantation stands as a testament to the power of historical memory and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of ultimate oppression. The 60 souls who died there in 1831 have achieved a form of immortality through their supernatural presence, ensuring that their story will never be forgotten and that the injustices they suffered will continue to bear witness against the systems that created such suffering. Today, as America continues to grapple with the legacy of slavery and racial violence, Southampton Plantation offers both a warning and a promise. The warning is that historical injustices cannot simply be buried and forgotten. They will find ways to make themselves known, to demand recognition, and to call for accountability across the generations. The promise is that the victims of history are not truly powerless, even in death. The 60 spirits of Southampton Plantation have transformed their site of suffering into a place of education, remembrance, and ongoing testimony. They have ensured that their lives matter, that their deaths have meaning, and that their story will continue to be told as long as the tobacco grows in Virginia soil. The cursed fields of Southampton Plantation continue to bear witness to one of the most brutal episodes in American history. The 60 enslaved people who died there on August 23, 1831, have refused to let their story be forgotten, creating a supernatural legacy that spans nearly 2 centuries and challenges every visitor to confront the realities of our nation's past. Their ghostly presence serves as a reminder that history is not something that happened long ago to other people, but a living force that continues to shape our present and our future. The spirits that walk the tobacco rows at dawn are not just echoes of the past. They are active participants in an ongoing conversation about justice, memory, and the price of racial violence in America. Southampton Plantation stands today as more than just a haunted house or a historical curiosity. It is a place where the dead speak truth to the living, where the victims of injustice refuse to be silenced, and where the legacy of slavery continues to demand our attention, our understanding, and our commitment to ensuring that such tragedies never happen again.